Okay, we've been wandering through this book written by this, groundbreaking female New Testament scholar who's taught at all these significant theological seminaries in the United States. And she is really very aware that, Paul comes off as chauvinist to some of us, outdated, opaque. She has really, in this book, wanted to kind of reclaim what it can kind of mean for us to be looking at this 2,000-year-old letter. So, but she notes in the last chapter of the book, she begins with this interesting statement. She says that one of the peculiarities of Romans is that Paul uses the word ecclesia, which is the word that is translated church in the New Testament, only in the final chapter of the letter. And she notes that there was nothing particularly Christian about the term. It was just used for any kind of assembly. So, you go to your PTA meeting, that would have been an ecclesia. You go to Democratic Party 14th Ward Wednesday night meeting, that would have been an ecclesia as well. So, so it leads her to kind of once again, to circle back to one of her major themes, that the book is really, or the letter is really unlike other letters of Paul, which really are more focused on that particular small little fledgling house church, that it's really a manifesto that is much more universal. And when we're reading it, we need to think about ourselves as an audience of larger than one, that it's not being written to just us, just me, just Sixth Church, but for the whole human race, so to speak. That's how cosmic the book is, because our crisis, according to Paul, is that it's that cosmic and that universal. We're caught up in sin and death, and who is to save us, and who is in a position to condemn, as he'll rhetorically ask. So I was thinking about this because we're struggling with, well, what is worship going to look like sometime later in this year when we get back, and what is the live stream? Should we keep live streaming when people are going to be able to be back? I mean, we're all imagining a day of herd immunity with everybody vaccinated and getting back to it. It is. But one of the things that just really struck me when I came is that unlike the rest of the experience of churches in America, where, like in a Presbyterian church, 35 to 40% of the membership will be in church in any given week, Sixth is really committed to one another. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think it is that most all of our church membership, when we were meeting together, is gathered together on Sunday and makes that commitment?
Clearly, we like it. We want to be there. Perhaps because we're so like-minded, for better or for worse.
Kate Tivoli once said to me that Sixth, it consists of people who took a long time to get to Sixth, which means that they had a long journey to get there, whether it was dealing with, in her case, finding a church that would honor her identity as a human being, or their identity as a human being. Let me get the pronoun right.
Mm-hmm.
People who had tried out other kinds of various traditions and were looking for something, or were looking for our values. So that's what, and the reason that impacts it is, for us as a staff, we're constantly talking about, when we're back in public, do we continue live streaming? What does the live stream look like? Or do we want to emphasize that it's really important that a central part of being a Christian community is to be together? Oops, gosh, what did I do?
Carol, you're raising an extremely interesting point. You said the reason we have this big number in worship is that because we all think alike. That was your question. Now, you didn't give us the answer. You just asked that. I think that's a very intriguing question. I don't know the answer. We had this fellow come from seminary who to help us with church and community. We did the values clarification.
Right.
I can't think of the gentleman's name. A very well-known individual, and he
Astute.
said, this was about a year ago. This church is unusual because all of you think the same thing. He didn't say that exactly. He said, oh, you know, you're all on the same page. You all believe in the same things. Oh, I go to these churches where they're riven by controversy, and you guys your values are all in line with each other. So maybe that's very true. Now, could that be a good thing? Yeah. Could there be some downsides to that? Maybe so. I don't know.
So alignment and clarity helps us to know what it is that we would expect. Pam, go ahead.
I think there's two things. I think I have been in churches where there's huge conflicts going on. Sometimes it's underground conflicts, but if you're anywhere up in the leadership or close to the leadership, you know it's there. And so you have this tension going on all the time, which I don't feel like we have at Six. And the second thing is, I think there's so many churches that say things, but do not live out their missions, do not, you know, they say, oh, we want to do this, but nobody does anything. And, you know, that kind of thing. And I think Sixt is more likely, I mean, we're not perfect, of course, but more likely to live out their mission. And it shows up. I mean, for instance, the first year I was there, I was in total shock. I went to the congregational meeting at the end of January and found out that, 10% of our, anything we raise, including raising for the organ at the time, which is what it was at the time, goes to mission. I was in total shock because church I came from, they raised money for the rainy day fund that they never used ever for anything. And so I think it's that kind of stuff too. So yes, in a sense, we're on the same page, even if individually things we may be somewhat different, but it's not a huge conflict.
So what I hear is clarity and alignment help communities have cohesion, and then it's very good to be able to have some real close connection between what the values are that are stated and the actions of a community. And so
there's another aspect too that I'm thinking about, and that may be an ability or a willingness to deal with ambiguity, not to be too vested in certainty, to recognize the uncertain, except that we are accepted both with one another and in God's love and salvation. And so there's room for differences, and the value is that we value those differences and are willing or able, or at least try, to listen and hear and synthesize and be moved. And Vincent, I think the clergy would call that being moved by the Spirit. I don't quite understand what that means, but there is something in this congregation that not only allows it, but values it and welcomes it.
Thank you. That's an interesting observation that I don't think we always lift up, but that while it's interesting paradox where there's some clarity about our values, there's room for people perhaps to really have very different kind of experience and live their own particular truth. Good. I mean, let's keep those in mind as we're thinking about, just as we're thinking about what she's going to have us take a look at various points in this last chapter of the book. So pulling that back up. And it's pretty clear to me that 4/6, there is this central notion that our gathering on Sunday is really, really critical to who we are. And so I want to pull back to something that she, I don't know why I'm having trouble with that. She immediately goes to a really significant part of the book, in the later part of the book, this quote, just as in one body we have many members, and all the members do not have the same use. Thus, although we are many, we are one body in Christ and members, each one of others, which is a passage we looked at last week. We looked at the longer passage of Romans 12, but just this notion of being knit together, which was very much an understanding in the New Testament world, that once you were a part of a community or were initiated into a community, that was a very significant bond that you did not take lightly, which is very different from the individualistic notions in our own culture, that your commitment to a community is voluntary, and when you make that commitment, you also have a lot of freedom to say, I am not going to honor that commitment any longer. We used to talk about, particularly when I was in suburban settings, how we would have to deal with what we call church shoppers, because consumerism is a really significant kind of power and influence on each and every one of us. And so people would just kind of shop for church like you would shop for anything else. And I'm not really making a pejorative judgment about that, but how the experience of moving in and out of communities pretty freely would have been kind of foreign to the world in which Paul's writing. So he said, Gaventa says, in talking about church in Romans, being members of one another means that there is a relationship from which there is no exit plan. Having been brought together, Christians do not have the option of walking away from one another. And, she's talking about what Paul assumes and writes about in Romans, but which is a little bit foreign to our own ears. The capacity for churches when things are difficult in community for people sometimes to hang in there with the communities, it's really hard. So I just wanted to ask, all of us are very committed to this community, but I guess I will change the question that's on the screen, but have there been times when it's been really challenging to be in the community and you really kind of wanted to walk away and did, or chose to stay, and why?
I don't agree with that at all.
Okay, fire away.
I don't believe there is no exit plan. And I don't think once brought together, Christians do not have the option of walking away from one another. I walked away from a church because I believed God was telling me to walk away from it. The church was toxic and getting more toxic. And I got, help from people outside the church, like at the presbytery level. So I wasn't totally walking away from Christianity, but I was definitely walking away from a community of believers because the church was toxic and the church is now closed. So I don't agree with it. I think God is telling us. I mean, it took me a long time to realize God was telling me I need to leave this church. Otherwise, I would have left Christianity, period. And then I found 6. And I think church shopping is actually a really good thing. I do not think it's a bad thing. I think it's needed. And I think, Carol, I think you were the one who said that it took us a long time to get where we are. That's one of the good things about 6. One of the things that's bad about many churches, especially in Pittsburgh, I don't know if that's true everywhere, is people have been there forever and they've been there so long they can't even see what the problems are because they've never had anything else. And so I don't agree with those statements at all.
Well, and it comes up in other places, you know, how do you hang in there in a relationship, a personal relationship or a friendship, or how do you hang in there with a job, or why do you hang in there with a community, or why do you hang in there with a cause? And when are you being asked to walk away from it? I don't assume that anybody hasn't agonized around those kinds of decisions.
Well, Ann Landers used to say, are you better off with him or without him? And I think Pam answered that question. Which way is she better off? I'm thinking it a little more, not global, but citywide, with the closing of so many Catholic churches. I mean, I have Catholic friends who are really suffering from the loss of relationship that is imposed upon them. Not that they're choosing to leave, but that their church, their community has closed and is supposed to merge with these other people. I mean, you know, we talked about merging with Waverly a number of years ago.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And it just seemed, I mean, they're a fine Presbyterian church with good people that we all know, a good program right there at the corner of Braddock and Forbes, and two big buildings. It makes a lot of sense. Oh no, it would never have worked.
We have found it's been universally a failure across the denomination to get faith communities to merge.
Well, the Catholics are doing their best, aren't they?
It has an incredibly high failure rate.
Uh-huh.
You know, I know I've told this story,
Cliff.
so if you've heard the story, you'll hear it again briefly. I had this business for many years. I was in financial planning. And I began to notice as I got on to be, you know, late 60s and was approaching retirement, I began to see something happening with many people. They had been my clients when I got started at age 40, and they had aged with me. So we were all aging together, and everybody was reaching age 65, 67, 70. And I began to notice that everybody was getting mad at their faith community, not just Presbyterians. Jewish people would say, oh, I was sick of that temple. Catholics, oh, I'm, you know, so sick of the parish. Muslims, oh, I don't believe that anymore. Mormons, oh, that, you know, something was going on that had nothing, it was not congregation specific. It was not Christian right. I'm sick of the Christian right. I'm leaving. This is congregation is homophobic. I'm leaving. It had nothing to do with that. I began to think it has something to do with human development. Maybe it's something happening to people when we get to in our 60s or 70s. And some people would drift back to their faith community, some would not. So something is going on that I did not understand.
Interesting.
Well, there's a distrust of institutions in general, the sociologists are telling us. Certainly marriage. So many people are choosing not to be married. Childbearing, government, churches, clubs. Ask any membership organization. The League of Women Voters owes its growth in membership to Donald Trump. Absolutely.
I have an altogether different reaction.
Good.
Fire away.
In the 16 years, how's that possible? That I've been attending nearly 16 years that I've been a member.
Me too.
There are many times when I've wondered if I should have an exit strategy, because I found myself out of step with other people at 6, either because of the real sense that I had a whole lot less income than most people, that I was much further to the left politically than a lot of people. And I wondered, is this really where I want to be? But the answer has always been yes. and at the same time, and this is I don't mean it to be in contradistinction to Pam, but it's going to sound that way. It also gave me a great sense of satisfaction to be able to walk to church every Sunday morning, feeling as though I was part of a long tradition of Christians attending their parish church. And I thought, or even Presbyterians back in the day, right? I mean, I can tell you, because I know a little bit about this, that Presbyterian churches used to be built about 5 miles away from one another so that families could go, get to church relatively easily. So part of that tradition, and it felt good, that I was part of a community of believers. And I suppose something that I think Vincent and Carol said made me think of something. When I started coming to Six, I was within a decade of the breakup of a long-term marriage. And so leaving the developing, evolving, unfolding relationship with the people with whom I worshiped was not something I wanted to do readily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, Beverly will make this comment about Paul, and that is that these ties that bind us are very, very important. And while we may take issue with this notion of there is no exit strategy, I think it's a corrective to this notion in America that we can just walk in and walk out of our relational commitments to one another. All of you, Pam, you took very seriously over a long period of time whether or not you needed to stick in with that church. And so you were fighting competing values within yourself. That's much different than the careless, drop in, drop out. I don't like one thing, so I'm going to leave. And Paul, this is running throughout Paul. If you're near in chapter 14, if you're near a Bible, and again, I forgot to tell you to find your Bible. But in chapter 14, and I'm just going to hit this before we kind of conclude, his statement here is, welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Some believe in eating anything while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. And then he jumps down to verse 7. I want to jump there to just kind of make sure that we get through this, where he says, we do not live to ourselves and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And so there's this notion of these ties that bind that are really, really deep. They're powerful. They're initiated by God. And that creates a way that we are in community with one another where, as Paul will eloquently say in another letter, look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And the only reason I wanted to talk about this a little bit is because we had kind of a vignette of that at our last session meeting that seems insignificant, but to me seemed very powerful. The worship committee had met, we're meeting via live stream, we're not together. And we have this ritual of having communion on the first Sunday of the month, like today. And so we went around, and the committee was of very much like mind that because we are not together, communion is not as meaningful. So maybe we do not need to be having it every month. Because, if you're partaking in it, you're doing it in the privacy of your own home without all the other people that are a part of the community. And that's a significant value in the sacrament, right? We recognize our bond as a community by taking of the one loaf and the one bread. So the recommendation to the session is that we just have it once a quarter to fulfill the Constitution. But there was a minority on the session who was very vocal that even though they understood, yeah, Carol, you responded to that. So I'm not going to put words in your mouth. Tell us why you responded not favorably to that recommendation.
Well, again, I don't know whether it's out of habit that here I am, in my late 70s. And that's such a meaningful sacrament to me. And whether I'm taking it at home with my nearly cold coffee and the crust of my English muffin, or if I manage to open a bottle of wine and have that, I know that other people are doing that too. And it's a ritual. I understand that, but I do think that people need their rituals, or I need my ritual, and to have that taken out of our service, even though it's remote or online or whatever we're calling it. It just did not feel right to me. Then we went into the discussion, well, somebody has to go and prepare the elements for Vincent and then go clean up or something. True, that's true.
And none of
So
us,
what?
while we're here, the 4 or 5 of us in the worship space don't partake in it. We're just, we don't have, we don't distribute it. But this was a minority opinion, but, warmly, passionately felt. And so the community said, we ought to honor, in the words of Paul, not so much those who are weak in the faith, but those who have this conviction, even though they might be in the minority, that it's important enough for us to do that. So the community said, well, thank you very much for your recommendation, worship committee, but we are going to continue to have communion on the first Sunday of the month for all the values that Carol raised. And so in a very simple and profound way, that is how the community kind of lives out its values, right? So that there's a protection for those who, might feel more vulnerable for something being taken away and feel bereft. And so others kind of stepped to the plate and said, well, of course, even if it's not that meaningful to me to have it in the privacy of my home, I understand that it's important for you. So,
well, we'll have to ask Peter if that's the tyranny of the minority.
I just want to mention one little thing. I have a lot of opinions about sacraments, obviously, and so I find this whole discussion fascinating. But before I go there, let me just mention the recent issue of the Princeton Outlook. I'm always flogging the Outlook. Has a discussion that's right on this odd topic. It has a long article about church conflict and an obituary about a legendary person whose whole career was solving conflicts, dysfunctional relationships, not just in churches, but corporate boards of the League of Women Voters and, your businesses and PTA, everybody. The same dynamics are working. And his analysis is, this will not be news to you, there's something self-selecting about church leadership. His analysis, after dealing with conflict for 40 or 50 years, is church leaders tend to be people pleasers. Great value is placed on harmony. Anxiety is seen as bad. If we have anxiety, that's seen as a negative thing. He says that's not, that's a misunderstanding. Conflict is seen as a bad thing. Oh, we're having conflict, that's bad. That's seen as a negative thing. It's not bad. That's when you begin to get growth. So he has a lot to say, very insightful about church conflicts, how they don't get resolved. Incidentally, our congregation has gone from 1,250 members to 200 members. Are we good at resolving church conflicts? I think we are. I'd say yes. I don't know. So anyway, the recent issue of the Outlook I found was absolutely eye-opening.
I've got to once again get to the door. Patty Halverson forgot her keys, so continue among yourselves. I'll be right back to wrap up because I need to get ready for live stream. Be right back.
Cliff, I agree with you that conflict is good, but boy, it's hard.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm quoting this pastor in the Outlook. That's not my opinion. That's what he says. He says, don't be too nervous about conflict. That's his recipe.
I agree that conflict can be a place for growth. There's no question about it. But but it is very hard.
It's also a
takes you-
skill.
Yes, yes.
It's a skill. It's not easy to have a difficult discussion. And sometimes we have to recognize, okay, it's time to have a difficult discussion.
Mhm.
And here it is. And that's something of a skill that some have
Yes,
and
how
some
many
don't.
how many workshops on conflict management have we taken over our professional career? You know, you outline the skill, your listening skills, and your repeating of their point of view, and it's still really hard, especially if you're close to that person personally, because you have not only the issue at mind, but you have the relationship that is in peril or could be imperiled. But I remember back in high school, my youth group leader said, you have to do hard things.
Well, and
That's where growth takes place.
yeah, and let me give you a more poignant example that was, and you lived through it, but when I heard about this was, I thought, something that said to me that this was kind of a healthy community that Paul is always trying to lift up in all of his letters, including to Romans. You know, remember that, you know, one of our dear members, Roger, it came out that there was, you know, it was front page news in the Post-Gazette that he had had a history that the community did not know about. And so that evoked some very strong, different reactions in the community. But my own personal therapist at the time had been somebody who had been called in by the session to do listening with the congregation. And he was incredibly impressed at how people who had very different reactions about Roger, some really feeling betrayed and hurt, and others feeling, you know, there was a lot about him that was good and marvelous that we miss. You know, one of the things the therapist said, I was so impressed with how the congregation, the community hung in there with one another and listened to each other, given how difficult that was for that news to surface and how deep the relationships were with him. And, you know, the fact that, you know, John McCall went to visit him on his deathbed and felt like he needed to do that. I mean, all of that, you know, incredibly controversial, difficult kind of situation, and yet the healthy kind of adult and mature way that people hung in there with one another, because that could have been incredibly, and I'm not underestimating, maybe it was incredibly divisive, you all lived there, but I saw that as a sign of health. I saw that as a sign of a Christian community trying to authentically being together with one another, not thinking for an exit plan, but how do we live through this?
And thank you for bringing up John McCall's incredible gifts of quiet leadership and presence, always, in so many of our lives, in minor and major traumas.
Because that like-mindedness around values was a hard-fought kind of thing, because people did leave because of the decision around more light, and yet that gave the congregation an alignment and a clarity going forward that we all benefit from today. So, but Gaventa ends her book by saying it's these themes of Paul that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that Paul writes in Romans, but this salvation is available to all, and that there's this power working in the world that is greater than sin and death, and that he says so eloquently, you know, not powers nor principalities nor things present nor things to come nor height nor depth will be able to ever separate us from this love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. And so it's in that hope that we always gather, and that Paul lifts up in the book. We're done for the day. Next week, Mary Radcliffe is going to be here. She is a researcher. She works with 538, which we all clicked on every day during the election. She's going to talk about what they got right, what they need to do better, what are some of the implications. It's going to be kind of a freewheeling Q&A. She says, I've got a short presentation, but I really want to deal with people's questions. That's going to be next week at 9:45. So